she was unbelievably kind. She was a fantastic employer. I'm now going to say I was paid £18 a week to start with.
Stephen, would you like to say something about what it was like working with Margaret Thatcher? I imagine you're going to take us to the days of her premiership.
Well, I joined Margaret Thatcher at Downing Street in 1983, and I worked with her during the election very closely. I was summoned to number 10, and she spoke to me for an hour. I didn't get a word in edgeways. I can't remember anything she said. It was a complete torrent. She didn't even say, you got the job. I just listened to everything she said. But the remarkable thing about the way she operated in number 10 was that the way in which all the great principles that were mentioned in the film, which we know dictated her premiership, were reflected in the way she ran number 10. For example, she was very economical with taxpayers' money. So very early on in her premiership, she had a reception for private secretaries of all ministries. And she went up to one person, Eric Sorensen, and said to him, "Where do you work?" And he said, "Environment." "Ah," she said, "you're the Property Services Agency. Come with me." And she took him into her study and pointed at the armchair. And she said, the PSN, the government body, had just had this upholstered, and it had cost £1,200. And she phoned up John Lewis, and they could do it for £180. So what were the government doing about that? She sat at the corner of her study in an armchair, so the carpet by the chair was completely worn out. And the officials at number 10 said, "Well, it's terrible, it's quite threadbare. We must recarpet the entire study." And she said, "I'm sure there must be some spare carpet somewhere in Downing Street that you can cut out a square to put in it." And the trouble was that of course, the whole of the carpet of the study had over time completely faded, and the new piece of carpet was bright green. But she absolutely insisted on having the square bit of carpet put under her chair. The other thing, if I can just go on for a moment, is her loathing and abiding of the Foreign Office, about whom she was deeply suspicious. And I was briefing her for Prime Minister's questions one day. It was just myself and one private secretary in the room, and there was a piece of paper the Foreign Office had sent over, a short piece of paper with the information about an issue of the day, a foreign affairs issue, but the Foreign Office had tip-X'd out the last line. So the only line she wanted to read was what the Foreign Office had stopped her seeing. And she held the tip-X paper up to the light, deciphering it letter by letter. And we just sat there quietly. It was a very hot summer's day, and she had her hair done, so it was quite bouffant style. And she was off to the world. She was on the third letter of the first word, and a large bumblebee was buzzing round. And to my absolute horror, buzzed round her hair and then disappeared into it. And I had to get out of getting a glass of water with a piece of rolled up paper, walk at the back of her and hit her hair. The bee jumped out. She was completely oblivious of this. And we then went round with a glass and a piece of paper to try and trap the bee, which we did. We couldn't open the windows because they were all locked. And she was determined. The Foreign Office had stopped her seeing something, and that was the only thing that mattered. So these deep principles dominated the way in which she ran number 10, the way she operated.
1976. One was from December 1976. There was a by-election in Cambridge, and I was the Conservative Research Department boy, who was sent to help the candidate in Cambridge. And in those days, the leader of the opposition dared to visit by-elections. And it was midwinter, and we were summoned to meet the leader of the opposition in the car park of the Trumpington Arms, I think, a pub at Trumpington. And it was 7 in the morning, and it was freezing cold, and it was very dark. And suddenly there was a roaring in the darkness, and 3 limousines rode into the car park at great speed, sending gravel in every direction. I think all 4 doors, all 3 cars opened, like a scene from The Swede. And the leader of the opposition rushed out at 7 in the morning and said, "Take me to the battle." And I mean, to me this was extraordinary and inspiring. This was extraordinary leadership. And indeed, when she canvassed in Cambridge that day, we got the electors onto the doorstep to be ready for her, and she ran from doorstep to doorstep. So that tells me something about her power with the impressionable, as I was in those days, with electors. But my other story from 1976 is about the Shadow Cabinet. I attended a meeting of the Shadow Cabinet in June of 1976 on a Friday, and it was discussing what its immigration policy would be. And the division bell rang. Unusual on a Friday, but she found out that it was the Sikh crash helmet bill, a bill that allowed Sikhs not to be obliged to wear crash helmets. And Peter Carrington, who attended the Shadow Cabinet, muttered. And she said, "What did you say, Peter?" And he said, "Well, it's a bit rum, isn't it, that here we are discussing how to keep immigrants out of the country, and you're going off to vote for the Sikhs." It was a joke, Margaret. Well, it wasn't very funny. These people fought for us in the war, Peter. Fought for us in the war. Have you got it? And out she stood. And I was astonished, because to me, Peter Carrington was a giant figure. He'd been our foreign secretary. And here was this new leader of the opposition, absolutely imposing her authority and experience and principles.
I was junior member of the Conservative Research Department and had to go over to her office. She'd been in office for, I think, leader for, I think, no more than about 2 weeks. And she hadn't realised that she didn't have to do everything still, so she'd been to the photocopier, she was watering the plants, and I came into the room, and she'd been leader for 2 weeks in 1975. She gave a huge sigh, and she said, I don't know how Ken did this for 10 years.
Number 10 was a very, very happy place. I don't think anyone worked there in those days without pinching ourselves every morning when we walked through that door of number 10, thinking, am I really working here? And you loved every moment. There was no hierarchy. We all worked hard. People say, how did you cope? Well, you didn't even think about it. There was no overtime. There was no, gosh, I've got to go off to a party. You just, if you were working on a speech, you knew you'd be there till 3 or 4 in the morning. I mean, there were days that actually I really never even went home. I just rolled into the next day. And I was very grateful that elections happened when Trooping the Colour was being practiced, because we had very nice music playing, actually on postcards parade as we were photocopying the next speech. But she was, Alison would, and Stephen would say that, she was so caring to all of us. She worked hard, but we were a team. And I'll just tell one story about because we were talking about the unlike any of the prime ministers before, she really took an interest in the decoration of number 10. And there was one day when actually I was up in the flat with her, and she was doing red boxes, it was on a Friday, and she suddenly looked behind me at a lampshade, and she said, "Gosh, that lampshade's so tatty. I really think this weekend I need to remake that lampshade." I mean, this was in 88 or something. I mean, she was leading, she was the most important person in the world, just about. And I thought, she can't do this. So I said, well, they do very nice lampshades at Peter Jones. And I knew her diary. I was looking up to the diary at the time, and I knew there was a space in the diary. So I said, well, we could go to Peter Jones. And she said, wouldn't that be fun? And I ran down, I got the special branch. I said, can we go to Peter Jones? And off we went. We walked in. We went off to see the lampshade department. The lady who served us, I think, thought it was Janet Brown. When the Prime Minister started telling them how to make lampshades, she realised. Anyway, we went back to number 10 with 2 very nice new lampshades.
Thank you. Stephen, I think we should say something about Margaret Thatcher's leadership qualities. How did she lead?
Well, the most extraordinary thing was, number 10 was very small then, and we all knew what the mission was. There was no question about where we were going. I mean, there may be discussions about tactics and timing and how and when, but there was complete unity and clarity about where we were going. And so there were no such things as favoritism. I used to get from Central Office opinion polls, which I never actually showed her, because I thought, well, she doesn't really need to know what people want her to do. What we want to know is, how do we communicate with people? That's important, but not where we were going. And it's worth saying that although she had a very clear sense of direction, she was quite tactical. And the phrase that I kept hearing all the time, which I'd never heard from anybody else before or since, I think this must be some sort of naval slogan, was steady the buffs, steady the buffs. She was always very careful to think through what the implications would be of a policy and the effect, rather than going headlong rush into it. She also had, as anybody who worked with her know, this tremendous eye for detail. And just as one irritating for me, was that we had agreed that before the party conference we would publish a book of all her foreign affairs speeches. And so I got the great Alistair Lexton, then Alistair Cook, to edit the book. And I sent off the book to the Foreign Office, so they would put in appropriate photographs of all the leaders she was meeting, Mitterrand and Reagan and Kohl and so on. And then in September, just before the party conference, on Friday, the first copy of the book arrived at number 10, hot off the press, and she was in the flat. So I went up to the flat, very proudly, holding the book, and said, Prime Minister, this is hot off the press. And I gave her the book, and it just fell open as a page of a photograph. And she looked at it and said, well, that's not Bing Bang Dong, that's Ding Dong Dong. I had no idea where any of these Chinese people were. But from that moment, the book And every Friday evening, for about 2 months, I would send a whole box of books I had to sign to people she wanted to send them to, or I thought she should send them to, who'd written helpful speeches. And every Monday morning they came back unsigned. She never ever trusted that book again. So the thing you learned, and I'm sure everybody here who has worked with her, whether as in the number 10 or as ministers, many former ministers are here in the audience will know that if you got something wrong, she lost confidence in your ability. If you got it right, there was a long press conference for the general election. She wanted to know how much an increase in VAT would raise. And a man now, sadly no longer with us, Peter Cropper, knew the answer. And from that moment on, he was in her eyes the world's greatest expert on VAT. There was nothing he didn't know about on VAT, because he got one figure correct.
One thing on opinion polls, you mentioned, Stephen. I recall briefing her for her press conferences in the 1979 election, the one that first brought her to office. And it seemed most of the time that she and the Conservatives were going to win. But one day there was an opinion poll that put her behind. And I went in and I told her what was in the opinion poll. And she said, "I did not crow when I was ahead, and I will not whinge now that I am behind." I thought it was extraordinarily dignified. But another meeting I had with her was in 1990, in November 1990, when she had returned from Paris. She had not won on the first ballot for the party leadership on this occasion, and the cabinet had been to see her, one by one, and the advice, I think, of all of them had been that she should quit. I was not in the cabinet, so I wasn't part of that. I went along in the afternoon and I got in to see her, and I ended up being with her one-to-one. And I brought this story to mind because Nell Butler made it clear in her film that the whipping operation was organised back in '75 by Harry Lee, and I think she implied that Margaret Thatcher probably knew little of it. And I think this is probably very true of 1990, that there was not much of a whipping operation, and she knew very little of it. And I urged her not to resign. She looked at me, I think she had decided already that she would resign. She looked at me and she said, "All my cabinet has advised me to resign. Why would you say anything different?" And I said, because in this leadership election, where you know all the candidates, and many have known you for decades, you have not yet canvassed one. You've not picked up the phone to one, you've not spoken to one. And I think that if you invited them one by one into your office, even now, and asked them to tell you that they're going to vote against you, half of them will be carried out of this room in tears. And the look that she gave me was one that told me that she had never even thought of this. She had never, this is extraordinary, a woman who had been Prime Minister 11 years, who won that amazing victory that we're talking about in '75, had never thought of mounting an election campaign to save her political life.
It was very dramatic, really. She announced on the Thursday morning that she was going to resign. The ballot was going to be following Tuesday, so we actually spent that weekend packing up in the flat, and I'll tell just a tiny story. I think Carol was there Dennis, I think, had absented himself because he really couldn't be doing this. But this was the home that they had spent more time in than any home they'd had in their married life. And to suddenly have to pack your whole home up in a matter of days, on top of everything else, was pretty shocking. I went in at about 6:30 on the Saturday morning, and we were packing all day. At about 4 o'clock, the telephone went from the hall downstairs, and Mrs. T immediately said, "Who is it, Amanda?" And Jim, or whoever it was in the hall, had said, "It's your husband and daughter." Well, my daughter was 6 months old. And I said to Rupert, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Well, you left me the bottles made up, but I've been through them all and I don't know how to make a bottle up." Mrs. T heard this and she said, "It's Rupert and Emily, they must come up to see me." And so up they came. I have a wonderful photograph of Mrs. T holding Emily in her bedroom. But what was most extraordinary, because she still then went into overdrive because she had to find Emily a present. And there had to be some sort of toy. So we have a white fluffy cat that she gave Emily. And but the next moment, the telephone went. And this time, it was George Bush. And because it was the lead up to the First Gulf War. And that just shows she was still Prime Minister, she was still taking calls from the President of America. But at the same moment, she was actually cuddling my daughter, who is actually just sitting over there now. But that so shows the human side to her, and she could juggle these two sides. But roll on a few days, and she left Downing Street the following Thursday. And I'd spoken to Alistair McAlpine, who very kindly lent us a house in Westminster where we had a temporary office. And we went there when she came back from the palace to the office, and we tried to make things as cheerful as we could. Later that day, she needed to go to Dulwich, and this was a house that she and Dennis had bought. Dennis had spent a couple of nights there, but she'd never spent a night there. And we went out there, and we went into the kitchen, and I said, "I'll make you a cup of tea." But I went to the cupboard, and there were about 2 tea bags. I mean, it wasn't a stocked kitchen. She certainly hadn't been, buying her stores for that. And we sat in this kitchen, and it just brought home to me how extraordinary life was in those days. There she was, having been Prime Minister, and the next moment she was in a house that she didn't really know, and no support at all.
How would Margaret Thatcher, in this day and age, encourage young ladies of socio-economic depravity to become political leaders, to follow their aspirations, and to truly let their voice be heard in our community?
Really, she only got where she got to by incredibly hard work. I mean, she fought for everything in life. She fought to get to the grammar school for Grantham. She had, when she realised that she wanted to go to Oxford, she suddenly realised she'd never done Latin before. So in a few months, I think she had to learn Latin for the Oxbridge exam. She, look at how long it was that she had to fight to find a seat. She had to fight for everything, I think she would say, to get to the top. You've just got to stick at it.
For me, Margaret Thatcher was exceptional in this respect, that she always knew what she thought about everything. For some years I did a programme called The Moral Maze, and they used to ring you up in advance and ask for your views on ethical topics. and I used to hum and ha and puzzle and try to think what my view was. And it made me appreciate that she never went through that. On any subject, she knew her view. And that meant pretty much that any of her answers was predictable in the best possible sense of the word. So because she was at the top of politics for such a long period of time, whether she gave a long-form interview or whether she gave a one-word or three-word answer in the House of Commons, no, 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 you knew what it was about. The message was clear. And without wishing to be controversial, let me just say that I've never come across anyone in politics since Margaret Thatcher who knew what he or she thought about everything. One more question. Yes, Virginia Coffin.
This has been an absolute delight, and I'm sure everybody here has got so many memories of her amazing things she did, the impact she had. The question to me is, why did Mrs. Thatcher, with her background, which was not particularly promising, not suffer from imposter syndrome? What were her protective qualities that enabled her to have the confidence?
Because she believed that what she was doing was the right thing.
And I would just say, Virginia, that I don't know whether this was your experience, but I think imposter syndrome is the normal state of affairs. When I got into the cabinet, I kept thinking to myself, where is the person who's meant to be sitting in this chair? When I said to Margaret Thatcher that evening, please don't resign, I kept thinking to myself, where is the person who is meant to tell the Prime Minister not to resign? Because it isn't I. And I don't know whether she did or whether she didn't, but I know that when I first saw her in shadow cabinet meetings and foreign policy came up, she was quite naive. I'm not saying that I was sophisticated, but I could tell that what she was saying was not sophisticated. And yet, within a few short years, she was dominating the global debate. And so, one of the things I think that happens is that politicians have to learn so fast. They have to go from being novices to being experts. They have to go from being the new boy or girl on the block to the most experienced person on the globe in a matter of a few short months or years. And she, all the way through that, didn't think, who's the person who should be Prime Minister? She thought, I am the person who should be Prime Minister, and I will give it my best shot. Amanda, any last comment from you, perhaps?
Well, I just wish she was around to handle Mr. Trump.